Hey you, and welcome. In this video, we will continue refactoring our contact context API to work with the Firestore database that we have created. So let's dive right into it. Now in the previous video, I had made the new contact go into the Firestore. However, when we create a new contact, let's call it right now, submit, you would notice that it doesn't show any data. And there's two reasons for it. One is, if you notice in the URL, the contact name and the contact ID is an object of promise. The reason why that's happening is because we're not awaiting the promise that we have created in some area. We'll figure out which one. And the second reason for that is because we're never retrieving the data from Firestore. Right now we're just creating it, but we're never retrieving. So we'll also look at retrieving the data. All right. So let's take a look at how we can do that. First things first, let's await this promise. I'll go over to my VS Code. And where we do the navigation, it should be in the contact add.tsx. And right on submit, we have a navigate, and then it goes to contacts, then ID, and the ID is being taken from the add contact. But remember, now add contact is a promise. And for promise, we have to await them. In order to await, I will have to change on submit to an async function and then await that. So that should fix my problem with the ID. If I save this at this point, go back to my Firefox, and just go ahead and add, I think I have to refresh my page. Let's add a new contact, call this one Julia Singer, submit. Perfect. At least the ID in the URL is looking like it's a string, it's not an object anymore. So that's one problem solved. Second thing is we have to retrieve the data from Firestore using this ID of the contact. And let's go back to VS Code. In our contact context, up in the interface where we have the get contact by ID, let's change the return type from a iContact or undefined to a promise of iContact or undefined. So that promise can return either iContact or undefined. And then on line number 38, where we have the initial value for the get contact by ID, let's change that to be a new promise that will have a resolve function. Resolve function will return undefined, like so. All right, so that should take care of the initial value and the interface. Now let's do the implementation portion of the get contact by ID. Line 78 is complaining because get contact by ID is not returning the promise anymore. So let's change this to an async function. That should stop complaining, but we still have to do the implementation for it. And for that, let's take a look at the documentation by Firestore. I'm looking at the Firestore documentation, and instead of add and manage data that we were in before, I've moved to read data and then get data. That should be the piece of documentation we're looking at. And then I don't need to look at before we begin because we already did that portion. So all I need to look at is get a document. And in get a document, we can see the code that we want to work with. And what I'll do is copy paste this code, except for the import. I'll copy paste everything else into my VS Code in get contact by ID, and let's refactor a little bit. I'll comment the return and I'll save. That should auto indent for me. And then for doc, I will import that from Firebase Firestore. And then for get doc, I'll do the same thing. DB is already imported. We did that in the previous video from utils and firebase.ts file. So that's already done. Next, let's refactor a little bit. So for the document reference, it will be contacts, not cities. So that's our collection name. And the ID would be passed from the get contact by ID. Now there is another problem in our documentation for this function, is that ID is now a string, not a number. So if I scroll down, there's a problem here. And the reason for that is because our interface up top is not written properly. So if I scroll all the way to the top, where we have the interface, ID would be a string. And once that is done, let's go back to get contact by ID implementation. Let's continue writing more code. So I got the document reference. Once the document reference is done, I've passed it to get doc, which is going to be a promise, and await that. This is when the function is going to make a request to Firestore and get me the document that I'm requesting. And it's going to store that in document snapshot. Well, it's snap, but I can call it snapshot. That's what that is. And here in the if statement, we are checking if the document exists. If it doesn't, and gracefully just return nothing, or we can change the functionality. But in this case, it's just console logging it, right? So I want to instead return it back to whoever is calling it. So I'll just say, if it exists, return document snapshot data. It's a function, you call that, And once that is done, it will return a eye contact. However, Firestore doesn't know anything about eye contact or interface or TypeScript and so much. So we'll have to type it ourselves using casting. So I'll say as eye contact. So when you return this, just cast it as eye contact, and then else would be return nothing, like so. Great. There is an easier way to write this too. I don't really like putting if statements and then else statement. There is a neater way to do it where we can just return early. So if I do if and then make this condition opposite of itself, where if it doesn't exist, then just return early. But if it does exist, do the rest of the code. So that's exactly the same thing. It's just a little bit more defensive, where it returns early rather than continue execution of it. And we don't have to look at indentation to go further deeper into the code. All right, I'll go ahead and save this. So no more errors in our context. However, there should be errors in running the code. So if I go back to Firefox to see, there we are. There are error messages. Contact details is looking for a promise or a string value, but it's not really able to find that. So let's go to contact details. Contact details right here. And if I scroll further down, is doing parse int. We don't need to do that anymore because now it's a string, so there's no integer. Contact name, contact description. Yes, that's going to complain. Reason for that is because get contact by ID is now making a request to the server. It's a promise. And even though new React does work with promises really well, they're part of the ecosystem. But I will show you the method that is more common and popular at the moment because not everybody's on the latest, greatest version of React. And that is using useEffect, as we learned before. So we will work with useEffect here. Auto import that. And useEffect will only be triggered when the render happens for contact details. And in this render, I will say handle fetch, call that function. That function doesn't exist yet. We'll call that, and we will make that function right above is an empty function like so. And this function will then call get contact by ID inside it. So we'll delete this line, copy paste the rest of it inside handle function. And then this will be an async function, which will await the request that is being made to Firestore. And whatever it gets in return is going to be the contact. Now I'll call this new contact because we need to give our component access to this new variable that we're getting back. And the way to do that is just storing it in state. So I'll just call useState. useState will be type of any. And this will return contact and set contact tuple. We'll call, okay, useState did not import, I guess. No, it didn't. Okay, there we go. We'll call set contact right in handle fetch, right after the new contact is retrieved. You pass it down to set contact, and then set contact will now have access to the contact, which will take away our error messages. All right, so that should be fine. I'll go ahead and save this. I'll go to our Firefox, and now the contact edit is complaining, and the reason is the same is because we changed the ID from string to, number to string. So let's check that out. I'll go to contact edit. And in here, this is where TypeScript is really shining for us because this is all the refactor you would have to just figure out from the top of your head. But now that we have typed everything, TypeScript is helping us out, letting us know before you even test it, there may be other places of your app that are broken, which is just amazing. So let's take away parse int here. And I think that should be fine. Oh, get contact by ID is again a async request. So we have to do the same thing as we did in contact detail. So you can actually pause the video here, take a stab at it yourself, see if you can just copy paste the code that we did before. But I'm just going to go ahead and start now. All right. So I will do the same thing, call useEffect. useEffect will be called only one time. When we mount, we'll create a function called handle fetch. This will be an empty function. I didn't do it properly. It will be an empty function right there. And then get contact by ID will be called in the handle fetch, which is going to be an async function, and we will await the get contact by ID. It'll be returning a new contact, and we'll call handle fetch in the useEffect, and we will store this in state. useState will be imported from React. It will be a type of any. I'm not really typing this one yet. Const tuple will be contact set contact. We'll call set contact right in handle fetch with new contact like so. And then we have access to contact where we can pass it down to default values like this. So save that. That should take care of the error message. If I go back to my Firefox, things are working fine and I can see Julia Singer is being fetched. So let me just make sure it's working just fine. If I go add a new contact, let's call it John Baptiste, submit. And there we go. We're getting that information directly from Firestore by ID. All right. I'll see you all in the next video.